Is Kyle Winter Stoner, and I am the Research and Content Manager at the Arab American National Museum.
Hi, my name is Dean Esserdeen. I am a curatorial specialist here at the Arab American National Museum.
Thank you for joining the interview. I appreciate your time and effort for this, of course, for the students and for the topic we're going to discuss. For when it comes to like preserving history, what do you think? Why do you think it's really important for like anybody? Doesn't matter ethnicity or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's because we at the Arab American National Museum are very interested in individual histories. We try to push back against this idea that history is sort of produced by a few great men. And instead, we really want to focus on the individuals that have their own stories to tell about a place or a time. And so we think it's quite important to do outreach to find individuals who often think that their histories aren't important, but we try to emphasize that their perspectives are important because they can tell us something about a time period or a place that we would not have known otherwise. And so, yeah, that's one of the major reasons. Dean, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think that's the big picture idea for sure. I think there's a lot of power in personal narrative. I think that especially not just Arab American, but anyone coming from a background that has been like historically marginalized or historically, had their stories told for them. When we think about history not as like actual things that happened, but history is the story that we tell ourselves over and over and over again, whether or not it's true, right? Sometimes. And so a part of our job as historians is to kind of hold both of those truths at the same time. We look at the record, the documents, the things that people keep that tell us for certain, in some cases, what happened when. But then you also have to take into account the stuff that never gets recorded, right? We talked a lot today about, the role of museums is to not only tell stories, but protect and preserve stories for the future. And we can only tell the stories of the artifacts and the objects that we have. So we look at personal history, oral histories, spoken word stories as artifacts and objects in themselves, because someone's personal lived experience tells us a lot sometimes like volumes more than a document can, right? So yeah, I think just personal narratives, personal history is super critical in helping us understand a larger historical moment,
Thank you so much for that. And another question in regards to interviewing older members, how is that important? Is it mostly like related to preserving historical artifacts? Is that sort of a similarity?
Yeah, I mean, particularly for older members of any community, they are sort of the guardians of sort of older forms of knowledge, older ways of life that are, especially as sort of technology advances at a faster and faster rate, are slowly disappearing. And so I think it's absolutely essential to interview older members of the community. I know from my personal experience, I've interviewed my grandparents before they passed away, and I'm very grateful for that. And likewise, as they are also speaking about the rushing advance of technology, I feel like, at least my grandparents' generation, potentially our parents' generation too, they're sort of the last generation that still has like physical objects more, as more and more younger generations are used to everything being digital. And so as a result, with one regard, sort of physical objects are, you could argue they're more ephemeral and more potentially they could potentially be destroyed by fires and waters. But in another regard, they're also a lot more long lasting if they're preserved properly. When we have everything on the cloud and on the internet, instead of documenting all of our experiences, those are reliant on certain platforms that we assume that it will be there forever and have infinite space, but they might not be one day. So as we're sort of thinking about like preserving older families' histories and sort of trying to make the use of both their physical objects, but then also digitizing them as well on the cloud, so we have sort of all the bases covered in a way. So it's not purely on the cloud, but it's also not purely in the physical world as well. Yeah.
I think there's a lot of like sort of museum value, professional value in recording the oral histories and stories from older folks and our older generations. But even just on like the most like bare emotional human part of it, when someone passes, their voice is often the first thing in your memory to leave you. You'll forget how they sound. And so I think that inherently it's an incredibly powerful artifact to have someone speaking their own story in their own words, in their own language. Just inherently, to hear stories from your grandparents' childhood growing up in their own words means so much more sometimes than having it told to you from your parents, even though they're related. It's different to hear someone's story in their own voice. And we think about like the histories and years and generations that have been lost because no one bothered to record it, that whether the technology didn't exist. I mean, before we even had the technology, think of all of the stories, all of the history that we've lost. It's like the Library of Alexandria burning down every single time someone dies, right? So it's incredibly critical, like, for our purposes as a museum, but also like humanity. I don't know. I think that stuff's really, really important.
Oh yeah. Add something really quickly. So I recorded my grandfather's oral history, and it's on my phone. And I recorded it the year before he died. And I just can listen to that whenever I want now. And I put it on a cloud. And that's like, now that this is, I think this is the first recording of his voice that we had, like some recordings I made. So it's like his voice, presuming that we can keep the cloud alive, it's there for a long time. And so that's, I can give it to my kids and they can give it to their kids, etc. So yeah, super, as Dina's saying, it's super powerful actually hearing that voice. And in his case, Jamaican, it wasn't exactly Arabic, but yeah.
And considering that children, like, they'll become more curious about their past. So I'd assume that keeping it, hopefully the cloud would make it that far into the future. I would think it'd be very important for them to hear or like listen to like parts of the past they might have some sort of questions about, you know?
Yeah.
And following up for the last question, for the students who came to this trip, what do you think would, how do I explain it? How do you think the students will think if it's important for their sake?
Yeah. Well, the impression I got after this, the school trip, they just left right now, but I got an impression that people were quite engaged, and not just for their immediate sort of oral history projects that they have to do as an assignment, but I think it seemed that there are some individuals we were talking to that seemed interested in like the whole idea of preserving history, that maybe they might not have considered all that goes into it before, and that sort of intrigued them. And I think, yeah, I mean, another takeaway is that we definitely do, like, one of the goals of having students here was also to show what our jobs are as historians, as archivists, as researchers, and this is not something that has to be just associated with an institution. We're trying to, I suppose, empower students to realize that even if you end up not working in a museum or as a professor or whatever, that you can still be a historian, at the very least of your own family's history, but maybe even beyond that as well. And hopefully we sort of gave students sort of the first tools that they could use to start going down that path. And I got that impression talking to some kids, some students, that they actually were very interested in pursuing that. So.
That makes me happy to hear. Yeah, I feel very strongly about the act of like historical and cultural preservation, and I think that the positionality of the person doing the conservation and the preserving is also really critical. So what I mean by positionality is who you are, how you identify. I think that it's entirely possible and very common for two different people to look at the same object and see two different stories. You know what I mean? And so having those different perspectives matter in places like museums, where you're dealing with sometimes pieces of stories, fragments, where you could have something in the archive that looks one way to someone and then another meaning to somebody else completely, right? So museums historically, talking as an industry that's been around, museums come from old, rich, usually white men who have a lot of stuff, and they would often like open their homes to the public to like have people come look at their stuff that they've collected over time. And it does something specific to that story where it takes it away from the people who actually lived that history, whose culture that thing is from, and puts it in a box, in a case, and it removes the context of that item, of that story. And so one thing that I'm really passionate about is essentially removing the curtain from museum world and museum work. Because even when I was in high school, I didn't know that this was a job. You know what I mean? I didn't know that this was possible. I didn't know that you could do this kind of stuff. Even in college, I studied history, but I didn't know that museums were a part of that too. I didn't know that all of this kind of even more contemporary stuff, actually talking to a human being and recording their history, is also historical research. It's work. But you just don't think about those things because, I don't know, museums have historically been a privileged kind of place to be. And so it's important for folks like myself who are Arab, who are queer, whatever, people of different backgrounds, to be able to access these positions in these institutions so that someone else can be looking at this stuff, right? Someone else can, I mean, we think about the British Museum and all of the stuff that exists in the British Museum, and the like cultural relevance of those artifacts are in England. They live there, even though it's, Benin, or it's in Turkey, or like the origin of those items. Folks there are never going to be able to see it if they can't travel. They're going to lose that essence of their background and their culture. So we think about accessibility. I think that it's important to also provide different places of education for folks. That's like another part of this too, is some people don't learn in a classroom as well. Sometimes it's better to be learning in a four-dimensional space where you're moving through space and learning in a different kind of way. And we shouldn't only limit those perspectives and like thought practices, to people who pursue higher education. Museums are publicly accessible, right? Anybody can come in through our doors.